Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today we are going to be discussing Israel and Palestine, which is, I'm sure, going to be rough. I hope that the comment section will remain civil. The basic message today is sort of a follow-up to last week's produced video. In that video, I pointed out how affection for Israel, or rather unthinking affection for Israel, in the United States media is beginning to fade away. And I've honestly been surprised over the past week the extent to which that has been confirmed. When I produced that video, it was before anybody had started throwing rockets back and forth. But now, even after a number of Israeli deaths, and of course many, many more Palestinian deaths, the old narratives are not making a return. And yesterday, I was surprised to find that actually the US Congress is seriously considering blocking an arms sale to the Israelis as this conflict is ongoing, which is not something I thought I would ever see again. So things are changing. I mean, to be clear, Congress is considering just maybe not selling, exactly the bombs that are being used to bomb Gazan schools, as Israel is using them to bomb Gazan schools. So this isn't a massive shift away. This isn't like a huge break. But when you consider earlier practice of the US government, it is actually quite surprising, and it does indicate a shift. So I think that while last week's video might have been somewhat objectionable to sort of Israel superfans, this one is going to be objectionable, I think, to everyone, because there's some sort of really basic myths about the Israel-Palestine conflict that I think both sides cherish, that I'm going to do a little bit of demolition of here today. The suspicion I have, I won't call it a fact, the growing suspicion I have, which is the title of this video, is that Israel doesn't really need the United States anymore. Even if the United States turns against Israel in a much, much more dramatic fashion than we've seen over the past week, I think a lot of folks are invested in the idea that this will bring about some kind of magical solution to the situation. And I don't think that's the case, because it's not the 1970s anymore. It's not the 1990s anymore. It's not even the early 2000s anymore. And the world is kind of different. We'll be diving into that. Before some preliminaries, if you're new here, you'll notice that there is a live chat that is going on live. I don't have the mental bandwidth to check that live chat as I deliver my presentation. The way this is going to go is I'm going to talk for a half hour, 45 minutes, maybe an hour, going through some points that I want to address on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And then once I've made it through all of that, then we'll move to Q&A, and I'll start paying attention to what's going on in the live chat that is currently going. The live chat is a place with very few rules. You're allowed to express all kinds of ideas. You're allowed to say absolutely anything you want about the ideas I'm expressing, my personal character, my appearance. Go nuts. Make as much fun of me as you want. However, I do ask that you be civil to each other. If somebody is acting to be disruptive, to attack individuals in the chat, or just to disrupt the chat more broadly, then Logo Cool Extreme, our moderator, who has been fully empowered by me, will warn you, and then he will block you for all time. There is no appeal from the court of Loga. He is the be all and end all. He says what he says as far as moderation of the chat goes. So yeah, do as he says. For this chat, I think there's an additional corollary. I'm not going to accept any kind, Logo's not going to accept any kind of genocidal language in this chat. We're not going to accept, oh, we should just carpet bomb Gaza. We're not going to accept Hitler was right. We're not going to accept any kind of genocidal language, and it's completely at Logo's discretion if he sees that people are just contributing nothing to the chat other than racist abuse of either Israel or Palestine. Loga is free to do whatever he pleases to those folks in the interest of maintaining civil conversation. So with, I think the preliminaries out of the way, also, yeah, if you want to do super chats, which I am tremendously grateful for, this is not the most lucrative of professions. Please hold on until the Q&A period. I answer every question that comes with the super chat. And without further ado, let's get into it. So there are two really fundamental things that I have known about the Israel-Palestine conflict for about 20 years. And while my view of the Israel-Palestine conflict has switched completely, these two things have remained. I've talked about in other videos on the channel how around the time of the Second Intifada and 9/11, I was a quite vicious partisan of the Israeli side of this conflict, to the point where I would characterize my views at the time as openly racist against Palestinians and Arabs. In the time since, in the sort of 20 years of intervening growth, I have switched to the point where I now see the power relations between Israel and Palestine much more clearly. And while I always have an affection for Israel, I can see that what is happening to what Israel is doing to Palestine is unjust and something that needs to be corrected. So I've made a shift, but these two things have stayed. One of that was the first thing is the awareness that Israel's settlement policy, which has never stopped and has expanded dramatically over the past 12 years, was always something that made the peace process completely illegitimate. The settlement process had always made it clear that Israel was not serious about Oslo. In the early aughts, when I was quite viciously anti-Palestine, I was happy about that. I mean, I didn't really care. But as I've grown as a person and done some moral and ethical growth as well, I recognize that the peace process has always been sabotaged by the Israeli policy of settlements. That's one thing that I've always known. And the other thing that I've always known is that the way that most people talk about Israeli, US support of the Israeli military and Israeli policy more generally is incorrect. The way that people talk about it is usually, oh, we're paying for these bombs, we're paying for this destruction. If it weren't for US military support, then Israel wouldn't be able to do all these horrible things, and that they'd have to do more deals with the Palestinians or the Arabs more broadly. And if it weren't for all this open-ended US military support, well, then, you know, the Palestinians would be in a better position. And that's simply not true. That might have been true in the 70s. I think it had already stopped being true by the 90s, and it's certainly not true today. What the vast amounts of US military money, there's other aid as well, but it's predominantly US aid to Israel is on the military sphere. What that is mostly doing is not, in fact, giving Israel the wherewithal to be more brutal to the Palestinians. We're actually bribing Israel to be less brutal to the Palestinians. And I think that's been the case for decades. If you look at the sorts of things that the US purchases, we purchase things like Iron Dome. Iron Dome is, I believe, predominantly locally developed, though a lot of the missiles are produced in the United States. So the funding, a lot of the US military fund, I mean, there's tons and tons of things, but Iron Dome, the missile, the anti-missile system that Israel uses to stop all those Hamas and Hezbollah rockets, is funded largely by the United States. And what that does, Iron Dome, I mean, had existed before, but it was actually an initiative heavily supported by the Obama administration, because the thinking there is, well, if we can create a situation in which Israel is much, much safer from these rockets that Hamas and Hezbollah send, then Israel is going to be less interested in creating death and destruction in Gaza and in southern Lebanon and the West Bank. And I think that has actually proven to be largely true. The Obama expectation that this would make a more reasonable Israel has not been the case. But what Iron Dome means is that there is less Israeli death, which actually constrains Israel in the world sphere, which means that they feel less justified in killing others. because there's a certain level of death and destruction that is certainly, any level of death and destruction is unacceptable. But if the deaths of Israelis were higher, then the level of death and destruction that would be happening in Gaza would be much higher. I'll get into that in more detail. And fundamentally, this isn't just about Israel-Palestine, the money that we give to Israel. It's about regional stability. We also give a ton of money to Egypt and a ton of money to Jordan. As the oil industry becomes less and less important, and that's going to continue to be the case, the United States is going to continue to become less interested in the Middle East. However, the United States, Europe, the world, China will remain very interested in the stability of the Suez Canal. That is not going to stop being a tremendously valuable trade route. And I think what people underestimate is the amount of military power that Israel has and the ability that Israel has to not just create truly horrific results in Gaza, southern Lebanon, the West Bank, but at this point in Syria, Jordan, and Egypt as well. So it's important to understand that the sort of levels of military funding that the US pours into the region, I think Israel is the largest recipient of US aid by far, and I believe Jordan and Egypt are number 2 and number 3. Maybe there's another country that's in there as well, but there is more to the amount of money that the United States sends to Israel than just our very large affinity for the Israeli cause, or just some racist urge to murder Palestinians. It is, in fact, about regional stability. Of course, the fact that Israel is there, is the generator of a lot of this instability. But that's one of the things that the United States loves most about about Israel: the fact that it produces instability in the Middle East, which allows us to sell a lot of weapons. There is less stability. There is less instability in the post-Cold War era. There's a lot. It's harder for the United States to find instability to sell weapons off of, which is why it has consciously constructed instability in places like Ukraine, in places like the South China Sea, and Israel is tremendously valuable to the United States in that it creates instability. But there's only so far we want to go with that instability. We don't actually want Europe to be swamped by 100 million starving Egyptians. We don't actually. I think one of the great miscalculations of the past decade by the military-industrial complex and the U.S. government more broadly was, okay, going after Assad, that's going to create the right level of instability that allows us to sell a lot of weapons. I think what the U.S. government was surprised by was that, actually destroying Syria created a level of refugees and sort of nightmarishness that destabilized the European Union and actually resulted in the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. So it was a level of instability that got a little too high. So it's, I think in this video I'm going to do, there's a lot of questions that people see as sort of either or, like the US wants instability or it wants instability. It's like, no, it wants a certain level of instability. The United States is definitely falling out of love with Israel at the governmental and media level, but it's not like going from we love Israel, Israel's right all the time, to free Palestine. No, it's going from Israel's right, we love Israel all the time, to we're kind of embarrassed by this, and maybe we're going to start cutting down some of our military funding because it helps us do human rights agitation elsewhere if we're less associated with Israel. But it's not like the U.S. is going to be like, now we need an intervention, to give the Palestinians what they want. So these are, I think there's an instinct when talking about these issues to go like 100% one way, 100% the other, when we're actually dealing with tremendously complex gradations of U.S. attitudes toward Israel and Palestine, or U.S. preferences for the level of instability that the military-industrial complex wants. So these are very complex issues. So we're about regional stability. Yeah, and I've written here sort of endless levels of disengagement. And this is part an indication of just how whole hog 100% supporting Israel, the United States, has been for so long. There are levels of de-escalation of U.S. engagement with Israel that will be titanically important for U.S. politics and will bring about, great realignments in U.S. politics, but actually won't change the facts on the ground really at all. In part because from the Palestinian perspective, U.S. aid to Israel, even if it's dramatically smaller from the U.S. perspective, it won't look much different from the Palestinian perspective at all. For example, I don't think the United States is ever going to be, a friend to Palestine in the UN Security Council. I think it's possible. This is part of one of those gradations. I think it's possible that the United States might get to a point, probably not with this president, but with the next one or the one after, where the United States will allow there to be Security Council resolutions on the topic of Israel and Palestine again. That's a possibility, but both the United States and other Israeli allies, like, China and Russia, Israel's current leadership has done a great job of getting in the good graces of Russia, China, and the United States. They'll put out a Security Council resolution, and we'll give up, stop the embarrassment of what we've seen over the past week, which is the United States alone standing in the way of a resolution, but the resolutions won't say anything. So it'll be outrageous to IPAC. It'll be outrageous to a lot of folks in the New York City suburbs that the United States has abandoned Israel to let a UN Security Council resolution happen. But then the Security Council resolution will be essentially meaningless. So there's like endless levels of engagement. I don't know if it's necessarily a change, but it's sort of a solidification of attitudes in the Israeli public. Perhaps the Israeli public always felt this way, but Israeli leadership was more interested in presenting a more liberal face to the world. I have all kinds of involved theories about different generations of leadership in Israel. But before I get into that, I think it's important to talk about settler colonialism. Now saying that, I think anybody who's sort of a Israel superfan or particularly right wing is horrified that I said settler colonialism. Actually, I think it's a very good descriptive term, and it does describe the kind of country Israel is, the kind of country the United States is, the kind of country Canada and Australia are. It's interesting how all of these are British Empire things. It was really only the British that had an empire that was serious enough to produce examples of settler colonialism like this, or rather successful examples of settler colonialism. There was a lot of French settler colonialism that was extirpated. It was the British Empire that produced successful examples. So while I think a lot of right-wing types get up in a tizzy when you talk about settler colonialism, I actually think it's a valuable descriptive term. I mean, it is what the United States is and was, and I think that I think there's a lot of people on the left who use it as this incredible condemning word, like, oh, you're all just settler colonialists, and my response to that is yes. That is what my country is. I think that part of my love for my country and patriotism about that, I mean, it's not all that my country is. Settler colonialism is not all that Israel is. But it's, it is an aspect of what it is, and I don't see it as somehow disqualifying for love of my country to admit that, yes, settler colonialism is something that we did. But what's interesting is the difference in stages of settler colonialism that we see in the United States and we see in Israel. In the United States, we have a sort of 2021 settler colonialism that has basically gotten to a point where it sort of the settler colonial project has been so victorious that there's no real need, there's no threat anymore. It is not like it's not like the Ojibwe or the Chippewa are going to, or the Lenape are going to take over the United States again. They're not sending rockets. So we're at a point where of sort of the evolution of the settler colonial model in the United States, where it is, I think we've judged, I think quite rightly, that it is in our interest to be, for U.S. power, U.S. prestige, U.S. future, to be as inclusive as possible. It's in the context of, yeah, we won. So now let's see how we can get everybody on board with this project, just for more wealth, more prosperity, more stuff going forward. What Israel is at a point where it's basically, it's sort of 1850s era settler colonialism. They are still at a point where there are, I wouldn't honestly argue they are much more threatened by the Palestinians. I don't think they are much more threatened by the Palestinians than the United States was threatened by the Comanche or the Navajo in the 1850s. But the mindset of the United States towards Native Americans in the 1850s was horrifically worse than even the pretty bad attitude of the common Israeli citizen towards Palestinians today. And I think this is really my strongest case for a U.S. disengagement from Israel at this point, because it doesn't work. We're not on the same page anymore. Israel used to have a leadership that, no matter what they were actually doing or what the actual folks in the Israeli public believed, would pay lip service to the idea that we were going to do more for the Palestinians. We were going to pay lip service towards inclusion and freedom and liberty, and that's gone now. So U.S. efforts at inclusion, U.S. efforts at creating a more powerful future to better compete on the world stage with China, with India, with Europe, U.S. efforts to do that are now hampered by its association with Israel, which is a very 1850s style settler colonial thing. Now, when I say there should be some disengagement from Israel for our benefit, again, we're talking about levels of disengagement here. We need to get to a point where the US government can say, oh, it's terrible what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians, but we stopped our military stuff, X years ago, and I wish there was more we could do. And yeah, look, we supported that Security Council resolution saying, ooh, Israel, you're being naughty, don't do that. Because it's not like we're ever going to get to a point where the United States is going to support an intervention against Israel, or certainly, I think that's something that is bare bones. At some point, I'll do a video talking about Israel's deep-seated connection to Israel. It goes far, far beyond this, oh, the Israel lobby, or oh, the evangelicals. No, it's much more deeper-seated than that, partially because of our shared legacy as a British settler colonial entity. That is a part of it, but there's a lot more to it than that. But we're never going to get to the point where, say, somehow 60 years from now, there's actually powerful Muslim states in the Middle East again, and they encircle Israel, and they start trying to kick everybody out. The United States is going to be there just because of our connection to Israel. There's never going to be is going to be there to stop that. There's never going to be a level of U.S. disengagement from Israel where we are not committed to Israel's continued existence. So I think that's just a thing. But what we do need to do is get to the point where Israel's crimes against humanity are no longer directly connected to the United States anymore, because it's a liability for us. It's not. And if you're looking at this and you're suspecting that there's a kind of a horrific Machiavellian calculus on my part where I've kind of written off the Palestinians, and I'm mostly just interested in disengaging my country from this horrific situation that's going to develop and get worse, you're right. I don't see a lot of hope for the Palestinians. I don't see much more than the status quo. There's going to need to be a serious change in the way that Israel looks at Palestinians, to avoid horrific status quo going on for decades. And this is, I mean, I'm not an expert, but this is what I've seen over my past week. Like what I see is, people who talk about, oh, the Palestinian genocide right now are being hyperbolic. They're shutting down conversation in ways that's not helpful. But yeah, like I think what I see for the Palestinians is the status quo and worse for a couple decades until the US system is destabilized to the extent that we get a wider war. And in the, whether it starts in the South China Sea or Ukraine or wherever, and then during that wider war, I think there'll be sort of large-scale ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. I have very little hope for the Palestinian cause without a serious change of heart in Israel. And what we're seeing in Israel has been a serious change of heart. This is one of the most consistently. This is something that I think was a big facet of me being sort of scared of this issue and not wanting to look at this issue, because confronting this is just really dark. But it's across the line. Everybody agrees on this, to the point where there was a interview with Michael Oren, who I think is a former Israeli ambassador to the United States. He's born in Brooklyn, gave up his U.S. citizenship to become the Israeli ambassador to the United States, which is sort of its own whole thing. And he was sort of bragging about this development, which is like, oh, well, you got to understand the young people in Israel are more right-wing. In most countries, the young people are more left-wing. Well, in Israel, the young people are more right-wing. He's sort of bragging about this. He's really pleased about this and thinks it's fun and cool. But what he's bragging about and thinks is fun and cool is that the younger generations in Israel have become committed to the extirpation of the Palestinians in ways that older generations were not. This is in social science. You can see this in. It's perhaps unfair to focus on like Empire Files, man on the street interviews or whatever, where you talk to sort of young, not even crazy Orthodox looking, but sort of young, very modern looking Israeli kids on the street, and they're like, oh yeah, we need to bomb Gaza to dust, or like, oh yeah, why don't we just send them all to Jordan? The Arabs have plenty of countries. And yeah, I mean, Israel has become less and less committed to any solution to this problem other than a final solution. And I know that's really strong language, but that's what I see here. It's not genocide yet. It's, yes, I think, there are Israeli arguments to say, oh, we've done so much for these people and done so well by them, that I don't believe, obviously, but, compared to other crimes that were happening, even, that the United States, crimes the United States was supporting in the 60s, 70s, 80s, what the Israelis have done to the Palestinians so far is incredibly light, and it is, careful and da-da-da. But I think that to the extent that the Palestinians have been well treated, and I'm not saying the Palestinians have been well treated, I'm saying the Palestinians have been better treated than like peasants in Guatemala in the 80s or communists in Indonesia in the 60s. I'm saying that they've been, and I think it's arguable that to a degree they have been better treated than the South Africans under apartheid. It's debatable and getting less debatable in the direction that they're not. So yeah, like I think the Israeli arguments that the Palestinians are in better shape than like historic victims of genocides and ethnic cleansing elsewhere, those arguments are 100% true. But when you look at the younger generations in Israel, and Israeli politicians brag about this, when you look at the younger generations in Israel, you can see that the trend is towards more horror, not less. And that's really grim. I mean, like I said, I haven't done enough reading about this, but I do have sort of romantic ideas about, sort of Yitzhak Rabin. Sorry, I know I'm mispronouncing everything. Shimon Peres, folks who were there for Israel's founding and acknowledge and know, they know what they did, felt some kind of moral obligation to Palestinians and some hope that they would be able to set up a situation where the Palestinians were kind of taken care of, like taken care of in a positive sense, like had their own homeland, et cetera, et cetera. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of men like Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin have no interest in that. And I think whereas like the founders of Israel could sort of look at the PLO and look at and be like, yeah, I mean, obviously, fuck these guys doing terrorism and shit, but we did terrorism and shit too. And like they understood what it was to attempt to build a nation. And I think I can imagine, this is, I haven't done the reading, but I can imagine that they had a weird affinity with the folks who were dying to create a Palestinian state. But the later generations simply do not. Later generations in Israel simply do not. And it's just, I don't see a positive reaction here. I don't see, I think there was in the period of great U.S. hegemony in like the 1990s, there was an international community or international law that was important to here because the United States was in charge. In a context where fewer people are in charge, I think that's over, frankly. And I should talk about that a little bit more. So the question of, is Israel an apartheid state? The answer is yes. When Jimmy Carter first proposed this in 2006, he wrote a book, Peace Not Apartheid, in 2006. I figured I should probably go back and read it. I was outraged. I was like, how dare you claim that Israel is an apartheid state? Israel is, modern and great and happy and blah, blah, blah. Of course, when I actually researched it, even back then, it was like, oh yeah, no, Israel's totally an apartheid state, but it's unfair of Jimmy Carter to say that because there's a process. Because yes, if you look objectively, like all of the aspects that existed during South Africa, there's this guy on Twitter who's really interesting. Oh, come on now, Palestinians are in government and Palestinians have, all these separate but equal facilities. How could that be apartheid? And then you look at what apartheid in South Africa actually was, and yes, there were Black Africans in government. There were Black Africans on police forces. There were even these things. It's funny. There's a lot of stuff in South African politics that, from the U.S. perspective, just seems really problematic to say. Like there's a whole section of South African population which is in modern South African politics, you can use a word that is seen as racist and unsayable in the United States. And I think Bantustan is another term that feels very problematic and scary in the United States. But what Bantustan was in South Africa, it was basically a West Bank or a Gaza, except it was much smaller. It was this nominally separate place where they could shunt African population into these independent republics that were completely surrounded by South Africa, had no independent foreign policy or security strategy. So yeah, I mean, if you actually look at South Africa's apartheid, it's what's going on in Israel, except in Israel, they're winning. It's a much more effective thing of apartheid. And in 2006, when Jimmy Carter said this, I was outraged because there was a process and things were moving forward. And yeah, sure, it definitely, I have to concede, in 2006, this looks like apartheid, but you gotta understand there's gonna be a two-state solution. It's gonna happen. Like 15 years after Jimmy Carter's book in 2006, there has been no progress. There has been no forward motion. Israel has a very extraordinarily successful and developing and growing system of apartheid that's working pretty well for Israeli government purposes. I think there's a lot of folks on the left who, and this isn't just me saying that, I'm not making a courageous statement by saying that Israel is apartheid. The Human Rights Watch, which is a human rights organization that's often seen as sort of a branch of U.S. foreign policy that's more focused on, certainly more focused on Russia human rights issues than, Saudi fucking Arabia's human rights issues. But yeah, Human Rights Watch, basically a branch of the U.S. government, independent, nonpartisan NGO, now says that Israel has a system of apartheid. So I think there are a lot of folks who think that now that this, and there are also Israeli NGOs who say that what Israel has is a system of apartheid. So there are a lot of folks who think that this sort of magic word is going to make a huge difference now. That, now that the international community is comfortable calling what's going on in Israel apartheid, something magical is going to happen. Like sanctions are going to happen right after this. And it's all downhill from here because look what happened to South Africa. They had apartheid and I think that there are two really basic misunderstandings that people who think that this apartheid designation is a big blow to Israel are engaging with. Um, the first misconception is a pretty fundamental misunderstanding of what the relative power dynamics were in South Africa. In South Africa in the 1980s, 15% of the South African population, and who knows, I mean, that was the apartheid census is probably an overestimate. 15% of the population was um, was white. So if you've got a dominant population in a system where you're attempting to hold down 85% of the population of a country, that is simply not sustainable. Israel, depending on how you measure it, and this is key, Israel has between 50% and 80% of the population in the dominant population. So that is very, very different. That is, and this is a much better, more comprehensive and technologically enabled system of apartheid that Israel is running. The Bantustans, something that I mentioned, that in an effort to sort of shore up their collapsing system, the South Africans set up separate homelands for Black Africans within South Africa, so they could sort of get them off of their census and get them out of the way. Those Bantustans pale in comparison to what Israel has pulled off with Gaza and the West Bank. I mean, these are almost completely controlled areas that hold the vast majority of the Palestinian population. So even long after the two-state solution is abandoned, Israel has it well within its capability to maintain these areas as separate sort of prison camp areas. That can continue indefinitely until the fall of the U.S. system, in which point the Israelis can engage in a more final solution to the Palestinians. That's really horrible to talk about or even think about, but that is where I see things trending. So yeah, the Bantustans. So there are, I believe, out of the 10 million or so folks in Israel proper, 2 million of those are Arab Israelis. You've got 3 million people in the West Bank and 2 million in Gaza. So Jewish Israelis are 80% of Israeli population outside of the Bantustans. You include the Bantustans, the West Bank and Gaza, then you're talking 50%. So with the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza so comprehensively controlled, I think you're really talking about, with the Israeli example, a example where the dominant population is 80% of the population. And the classic argument that the Palestinians were going to outbreed the Israelis actually seems to be somewhat defeated by the growing power of more orthodox, traditional conservative versions of Judaism within Israel. So yeah, I'm not 100% on that, but my understanding is this assumption that the Palestinians were going to outbreed the Israelis does not hold as true as it used to, certainly not within Israel proper itself. So yeah, South Africa, you had 85% of the population was the suppressed. Israel, you have 20% of the population is the suppressed. Yeah, you're never going to get a sort of right of return for refugee populations outside of the West Bank and Gaza. And I think it's pretty clear that Israel has a not explicit, but an actual program of making things in West Bank and Gaza so miserable that people just leave. So some interesting things on Twitter. It's like, why don't we just let everybody in Gaza and the West Bank come to the United States? And hell, I'm for that. Of course, the fact that I'm for that out of common human decency is also and aid to guilt-free ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from, traditional Palestine. So yeah, these are all really awkward, ugly things that just do not get discussed. So this idea that now everybody says that Israel's doing an apartheid now, like is some kind of magic word that's going to change everything, is not true. There's another very, very important reason, and that's comparing the 1990s to the 2020s. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union did some really, really horrific things. And in the context of the 1960s, the 1970s, even the 1980s, what Israel was doing to the Palestinians was not like, I mean, it was bad, yeah, stealing land. But, there were, agency. It's not like these folks were being starved or murdered en masse. And that is something that U.S. policy was supporting in places like Guatemala, Indonesia. Well, Indonesia was the 60s, Guatemala was the 80s. There's all kinds of horrific, horrific stuff. What happened in the 1990s was a kind of glorious moment, bipartisan, under George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, was this conscious effort to do a sort of human rights cleanup in the aftermath of the Cold War. And that is what, that is why we have the Oslo Accords, because it was very clear, throughout the Cold War, Israel had been threatened by the Soviet Union and a large group of Arab countries that the Soviet Union was supporting after the Cold War. There was no threat anymore. The United States wanted to do sort of human rights house cleaning. We stopped supporting civil wars in Central America. We stopped backing horrific dictators like Mobutu Sese Seko of what was the Congo. He was Zaire under him and became the Congo again. All over the world. I mean, actually, I think the abandonment of Marcos started in the 80s, actually, under Reagan, but, in the Philippines, the United States wanted to clean up its act because the United States was, on the world scale, what it remains to be on its own domestic scale, was that the United States had won so comprehensively that we didn't need to do savagery so much anymore. So in the 1990s, we tried to clean up our act, and the Oslo Accords were part of that. Were part of and I think there was actually acknowledgement from Israel's leadership that folks who remembered what they had done to found the Israeli state, that they wanted to do some more peaceful things too. This era of the United States, A, being so completely dominant, and B, wanting to clean up its act a bit, ended with the Bush administration. It didn't even have to end with 9/11. I talked on a video on Friday how actually 9/11 was an extraordinary opportunity for the United States, because until, from September of 2001 until March of 2003, the United States really could do no wrong. It could do whatever it wanted in the world. What the Bush administration used that incredible free pass to do was invade Iraq and launch 18 years of horror and destruction. We're back to the bad old days. The United States supports all kinds of murderous assholes. We're not interested in cleaning things up anymore. And the United States doesn't have, I'm a big fan on this channel. I talk a lot about how, look, the United States is the most powerful country in the world, remains the most powerful country in the world. And its power has not faded to the degree that most assume, but its power has faded since the 1990s, relatively speaking, to a real degree. The United States isn't interested in human rights cleanup anymore. And if the United States becomes, as I would like it to actually, decides to dissociate from Israel to a degree, Israel's got plenty of other friends. So in the 1990s, the main powers in the world were the United States, Europe, and Japan. And all of those countries were interested in portraying themselves as sort of liberal democracies who were interested in liberal values and freedom and common decency in the world. That was their focus to varying degrees. And I don't think Japan had much of an input, but both the United States and Europe were very interested in pressuring Israel to resolve this sort of last, ongoing imperialist project in a way that looked positive and happy and shiny. That was the 1990s. In the 2020s, we've got a United States that's getting more nationalist and more interested in disengaging theoretically. We've got India and China, which are two rising powers who really, really want to have diplomatic and societal cover for their decision to brutalize their own Muslim populations. In the 1990s, what Israel was doing to Palestine was sort of like this last dark thing that most of the world wanted to clean up. In 2020, what Israel is doing to Palestine is a goal for the two largest rising powers. What China is doing in Xinjiang is, they could practically be, they might very well be comparing notes and technologies between the Chinese repression in Xinjiang and the the Israeli repression of the Palestinians. And India, which had traditionally been, I think, a big advocate for Palestine, the legacy of Gandhi, the legacy of anti-colonialism. Kashmir is a very complex situation, but throughout India, the current leader of India, Narendra Modi, is looking for ways to further brutalize and marginalize India's large Muslim population. So yeah, like this idea that you gotta, in the 1990s, not only is Israeli apartheid vastly more stable and built on a much more stable foundation than South African apartheid, the state of the world community is completely different, and it's one that is no longer as in love with fantasies of human rights and liberalism and whatnot, and is now acting on sort of more of a stage of raw power. And I think Israel's sort of brutality and in search of its national interests are now kind of an inspiration to countries like China and India, who would have formerly been, raging against them and their colonialism. To be clear, in the UN Security Council this week, China has been making statements talking about Israel's colonialism and how terrible it is, exclusively as a way to embarrass the United States. If the United States backed off, and allowed a Security Council resolution to go forward, China would, be partner with the United States in making sort of a mealy-mouthed, not particularly serious resolution that would be backed up by nobody. This is a very different world, and the idea that apartheid is some magic word that's going to change everything simply isn't true. I believe in human rights. I believe in world institutions that attempt to make things better and more humane. I think that, and this is another reason to call for a level of U.S. disengagement. Again, U.S. disengagement that would be cataclysmic change to U.S. politics, moving down to here, would be nothing like what the Palestinians want, which is like a free and independent Palestine. Like the U.S. can definitely pay lip service to a free and independent Palestine. To some extent, we've been doing that for 20 years, and we can get slightly more serious about paying that lip service to a free and independent Palestine to an extent that would completely upend U.S.-Israeli relations and U.S. politics, but would not actually get anywhere near, a free Palestine. So I believe that it is in the interest of human rights agitation anywhere for the United States to, stop us, just get a little more distance from Israel. Because at this point, especially this week, the United States attempting to speak about a legitimate horror that is happening in Xinjiang, or the insanity of, Modi disenfranchising 2.5 million Muslims who've lived in India for 50 years. The United States has absolutely no ability to talk about that when we're supporting what's going on in Gaza right now. It's a joke. It's silly. It is laughable on its face. And I think if the United States is to have any hope of any serious speaking up for human rights, we need to distance ourselves from Israel. That's just just how things are. All right, better serves arguing from the outside. Yeah. Now, talking about, just in the raw details of Israel doesn't need the United States anymore, I think it's helpful to talk about, and I talked about this extensively in last Monday's produced video. It's just a short 10-minute video. You can find it by going and clicking on the video page. It's the last video from last Monday. Israel has fallen, Israel's enemies are gone. Israel does not have serious enemies or serious threats anymore. From 1948 until 1991, it was seriously threatened by the Soviet Union and the Arab countries that surrounded it. Israel now has peace deals, or sort of de facto peace deals, with all of the meaningful Arab powers that used to threaten it. It's just not a thing anymore. Read an interesting book by Trita Parsi recently called Losing an Enemy, that sort of gave the history of, the Israel-Iran, the existential threat to Israel from Iran, and it's laughable. I mean, at every point, Iran would not have survived the 1980s without Israeli support and arming during the Iran-Iraq War. It was a conscious decision to sell. It was a conscious decision to sell the idea of peace with the Palestinians. Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres gussied up this fake threat from Iran, and then which eventually became real to a degree in the personified in Hamas and Hezbollah. To be clear, Iran was aligned with Hezbollah before the 1990s. However, in the early 1990s, Iran was willing to disassociate itself from Hezbollah to a degree in order to get better relationships with the United States and Israel. Israel decided to say that Iran was evil and trying to kill them all the time. And after that, Iran doubled down on its support for Hezbollah and started supporting Hamas, who are folks who actually have a different version of Islam than the Iranians do. So yeah, the Iran thing is kind of bullshit as well. I think there's a really, as far as, let's see, where's the best way to go with this? Okay, let's start talking about the amount of money that the US supplies to Israel. The Israeli defense budget is $21 billion. The United States supplies $3.8 billion. That is a really significant looking chunk, right? Except it's not, because as I pointed out, a lot of this spending is for things like Iron Dome that actually function to restrain Israeli action rather than make it more likely. And a lot of it is like the F-35, like extraordinarily expensive, extraordinarily uselessly expensive stuff that Israel could get more cheaply from other countries if it can't just make it itself. I think folks have been pointing out recently how these years of military support from the United States have helped Israel develop its own very high-tech, involved military-industrial complex. And it's generally acknowledged that Tel Aviv is the #2 tech hub in the world after Silicon Valley. And so much of actual warfighting at this stage of development is just tech and programming and jamming and this, that, and the other thing. So the fact that if the US stopped giving Israel a ton of money to buy the US's overpriced bullshit, it's not clear to me that Israel's security would be impacted really in any way. It's like they become less reliant on like some overpaid employee in Indianapolis to do shoddier work than they'd be able to do in Israel. Yeah, I don't think that, or China or Russia. I think that the really complex, like high-toned, the truly important, impressive stuff in missile technology, missile defense technology, and whatnot is actually like Israeli developed at this point. So the idea that the U.S. cutting off that $3.8 billion, I mean, would it hurt? Yes. Would it create an incredible tumult in U.S. politics and the way that Israel talked about the United States and the way the United States talked about Israel? Yeah, absolutely. But it'd have really almost, I think, no impact on Israeli security. Well, I think the fucked up thing is that while I'm interested in disassociating from Israel, because it allows the US to talk about human rights with any seriousness anywhere else in the world, I think the US disengaging from Israel would pretty much automatically make the situation for the Palestinians worse. In part because the Palestinians, conceivably, without Iron Dome, would be enabled to kill more Israelis. And if the Palestinians without Iron Dome are enabled to kill more Israelis, then the Israelis are enabled to kill exponentially more Palestinians. This is a really key thing. We talk about, I think a lot of folks are still really rooted in a war from 1973. It's true, in 1973, Israel was at real risk of losing a war. I have not done in-depth reading. My understanding is they probably would have just left. I've read some interpretations that said they probably would have just lost the territories they occupied in 1967, but there were some Israeli generals who believed that, they were about to get wiped off into the sea, and the US sort of held Israel hostage, and then eventually agreed to give them the weapons they needed to save themselves. That was 50 freaking years ago. Since then, Israel has become a dramatically more developed place. As I said, sort of the realm of military innovation has moved far beyond, despite what Lockheed Martin would want to tell you, like the speed or snazziness of a fucking manned fighter jet, to sort of more tech-oriented stuff. And in 1973, this is obviously simplifies things, but Israel was a fairly new country where most of their young people were working on fucking communal farms. In 2020, most of their young people are developing the high computer technology that is necessary for defense purposes. In 1973, Israel was surrounded on all sides by hostile, Syria, Jordan, Egypt especially, were very serious militaries that were dedicated to Israel's destruction. Today, Israel has been an ally with Israel. Something that's not really talked about is that none of the destruction in Gaza would be possible if it weren't for the collusion of the Egyptian government in maintaining this barricade embargo on Gaza. Jordan is, barely keeping itself together. Syria is, Israel regularly bombs Syria with complete impunity. Obviously, there's been a decade of war in Syria that has caused my God, because of refugee and displaced flows, Israel is now, if you include the Bantustans, Israel is now a more highly populated country than Syria, Jesus. This mentality that Israel would be lost without us hasn't been true for almost 50 years. And I think a really good way to sort of close this, I guess, is to talk about the 2006 Hezbollah war. I think this is a key part of Israeli right-wing ideology and propaganda, but it's also a key part of the way that I think a lot of pro-Palestinian, I think it oversimplifies things to say leftists, but the way a lot of Palestinian sympathizers see things, where it's like, if only, the US didn't support Israel, then things would be so much easier for Palestinians and freedom, and maybe Hezbollah and Hamas would present a real threat to Israel that they would have to negotiate with. And no, that is absolutely not the story of the 2006 war. I've been guilty of this oversimplified reading of the war between Hezbollah and Israel in 2006. The truth is that, yes, 100% in the war in 2006, Israel thought it could march into southern Lebanon and smack Hezbollah around and maybe even wipe it out. And Hezbollah humiliated Israel. That much of the narrative of the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war is true. But what folks really aren't paying attention to, something I emphasized a lot in last Tuesday's video, is that all wars are media wars. even with an Israeli public that is getting more openly, genocidal is not a nice term, but let's say genocide curious. Even with an Israeli public that is getting more genocide curious when it comes to the Palestinians, there are certain political impossibilities, not just related to the U.S.-Israel relationship, but also just related to, like, Israel does not want to become a world pariah, even with its value to China, to India. Like, if Israel, just started slaughtering folks en masse, there is, I know that it's important to be outraged about these 200 folks that have been killed in Gaza. I mean, it's probably up to 300 now. And yeah, but comparing this to like the 2014 Gaza thing, where Israel killed 2,000 people, that's different. And I hope, I think the consensus is that the current horror in Gaza and Israel is slowly is sort of petering out at this point. And if we could, end up with a quarter less dead in Gaza, we've actually already got dramatically more dead in Israel than in the 2014 Gaza thing, which is surprising to me, and I think is an indication of Israel being conscious of the switch in politics in the United States and the switch in politics in sort of the general world sphere. That's different from what the actual political constraints are on Israel. So what I'm saying here is that Israel, in all of these conflicts, has the upper hand to an absurd extent, and people misunderstand that because Israel engages in levels of slaughter that are appalling to advocates for, say, the southern Lebanese people or Palestinians more generally, but are actually carefully controlled to not get over the point where it's going to bother people in the world more generally, because Israel, is a big trading hub and doesn't want to get to the point where it loses world trade. So in the Hezbollah 2006 war, only 44 Israeli civilians died in the Hezbollah war. I think we're almost there with no. I think we're just into the 20s for dead Israeli citizens this time around. It's horrific, of course. I mean, every life lost is a tragedy. But this is the kind of math that the IDF is absolutely doing, and the Israeli government is absolutely doing. So in the context of, the reason that Israel was so embarrassed in their attempted invasion of Lebanon in 2006, and the reason that Hezbollah was able to look like this scary force that stopped the Israelis, was because Hezbollah was incapable of causing any real civilian death in Israel. If that changes, if without US funding, Israel decides not to do Iron Dome anymore, they're going to do stuff that's a lot cheaper than Iron Dome. So if, say, in the Hezbollah war, where there were 44 dead Israeli civilians, and it's hard to parse out from the sources I was looking at, who are fighters and who are civilians, but you can obviously assume the vast majority were civilians, that there were 1,200 dead Lebanese. So that kind of math for the Israeli government, it's like, wow, only 44 dead Israeli civilians and a total of 160 dead Israeli soldiers and civilians, or Yani, kind of like 160. The math there is like, well, shit. Like, if we've only had 44 dead Israeli civilians and over 1,000 dead Lebanese as we're invading, well, that looks really shitty. And like, we got to stop, and we've got to change our rules of engagement. We've got to change how we approach this issue. So something that a lot of folks had been wondering. Let's look at a hypothetical. Folks are asking, like, well, gosh, why isn't Hezbollah jumping in on this? Because Iron Dome, it's a missile defense system. If you can overwhelm it, you can absolutely overwhelm it. And Hezbollah presumably has much better missiles than Gaza has. So if Hezbollah had added on, then, oh my gosh, we'd have been talking about hundreds of dead Israelis, or even 1,000 dead Israelis. And if we get to a situation where we're talking about 1,000 dead Israeli civilians, I think that the Israeli government has made a horrific but quite accurate calculation that the world, or at least the United States government, will tolerate deaths in a 10-to-1 ratio. You kill 1,000 Israeli civilians, that means that Israel, in pursuit of its military, so if Hezbollah kills 1,000 Israeli civilians, that would mean that Israel, in its pursuit of military objectives in southern Lebanon, in its pursuit of wiping out Hezbollah, would be willing to kill not 1,200 southern Lebanese, but would kill 10,000 Lebanese. And this isn't something like there are, I know that this isn't something that people want to hear, as Palestinian children and Israeli children, but as Palestinian children are dying in their dozens. This isn't something people want to hear, but it is expensive and it is difficult to bomb a place like Gaza that is so compact and so urban and kill as few people as the IDF is killing currently. If there were 1,000 dead Israelis rather than 25 dead Israelis, then Israel would be more free to slaughter more civilians. And this is the case both in Lebanon and in Gaza. So actually, if Iron Dome wasn't there, then Israel would have a freer hand. If Hezbollah really had piled on and started the missiles, there is nothing that would have stopped the crush of the Israeli military, until you got to the Turkish military in Idlib. There's nothing left in Lebanon that's a serious military active. There's nothing left in Syria other than the Russians, who would get right the fuck out of the way of the Israeli tanks. The Turks wouldn't. The Turks would fight the Israelis. But if Hezbollah really piled on and killed 10,000, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 Israeli civilians, then we would have the invasion and occupation, and quite a bloody invasion and occupation. It couldn't be a long-term occupation, but it would be a short-term occupation of southern Lebanon and southern Syria. So that's why Hezbollah is not in here. So I think that was a very long way of pointing out that this idea that Israel is seriously threatened by Hezbollah, they're only threatened in the context of the media war, in the context of Israel not really being able to go beyond that 10-to-1 ratio. It's incredibly, let me emphasize, it is incredibly fucked up that in US politics and world politics, it's somehow okay for the Israeli government, that has all the power, controls all the borders, is infinitely more powerful. It's somehow okay for them to kill people in a 10-to-1 ratio. But that is the way it has been thus far in US politics. If it weren't for Iron Dome, if Hezbollah was to successfully kill a higher number of civilians, let alone if Hezbollah was to actually attempt to take Israeli territory, that would be the end of Hezbollah, and that would also be the return to Israel. I mean, Israel was able to occupy southern Lebanon for 10 years. Back when Israel had it was more than 10 years. What was it, 82 through 2008? For 2 decades, Israel occupied most of southern Lebanon. Not 100% familiar on those details. When Israel's military advantage was dramatically smaller, before Israel had deals with every Arab state in the region. So yeah, this idea that Hezbollah provides some kind of threat, this idea that U.S. military material is somehow vital to Israel's security. It's just not. Israel doesn't need the U.S. anymore, which both opens more possibilities, I think, for U.S. Politics, but also I think pretty sad for folks who are interested in a free Palestine. I do not see that happening. Sorry. All right. I think there were 2 super chats here. Mohammed Basra says, "You rock, buddy." I say, "You rock too." Thanks, man. And there was another one, wasn't there? I thought there was another. There we go. Okay. So we are on to the Q&A. If you have questions, if you have thoughts, I will now spend the next 15 minutes. Wow, I did an hour and 10 minutes. I apologize. I will do the next 50 minutes on Q&A on the topic of Israel and Palestine, really, and anything else you want to talk about. If you do a super chat, I will definitely answer the question. Yeah. Gary Davis said, Palestinians are not interested in peace. Arafat walked away. All this is the direct cause of what? One action. That's why I don't care. Yeah, that's just bullshit. Like, that's bullshit. As I said at the outset of this, sorry, Gary Davidson, thank you for the super chat. I should not be as dismissive, not just because you're doing a super chat, but that's a really common, that is a really common argument. You know, the Palestinians have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. You know, like that's a sort of standard interpretation. And what I've always known is that, you know, the point of the Oslo Accords is it was sort of meant to be a starting point. And I think Arafat and certainly Hamas have made incredible miscalculations in thinking that a violent approach was a way to get anything. Maybe in the context of the 1990s, violence was useful because, you know, we were also guilty and wanted to, you know, make up for the human rights things of the Cold War. Like, that's over. Like, you know, Palestinians acting as violent actors now are just giving the Israelis the excuse to kill exponentially more Palestinians. That's what it is. And it's in the context of an international community that no longer gives a shit. But yeah, this idea, it's absurd to me. It's like saying this, Gary Davidson, so your argument is it's in the context of this idea that the Palestinians and the Israelis have ever been negotiating on some kind of like even playing field, and that the Israelis have ever honored their obligations from Oslo. They have not. You know, the settlements have continued to grow in the West Bank against international law, against the progressively smaller and smaller objections of the U.S. government. You know, when Arafat didn't turn down a deal, he didn't turn down a deal because it didn't include, you know, commitments to stopping the settlements, like, which were just like the baseline spirit of the Oslo Accords. So yeah, like there's a lot, I mean, Gary Davidson, like there's a lot of justifications. Of course, you can look to a lot of reasons why, and I think this is why Israel is becoming much more of a right-focused approach. It's exactly the same kind of argument, Gary Davidson, you're making there, which is like, well, you know, if black people would just be more polite, you know, they wouldn't get shot at all by cops. Like, it's, yeah, I mean, it's a kind of argument that is good for people who don't pay much attention. It's a good argument for people who don't actually have much of an idea of what the relative power levels are here. It's a good argument for people who don't know much history. But it's not actually, I think, an argument that I find persuasive. But I think it's a very common argument. Yeah, like I think that's something that is good at shutting down conversation a lot. Because honestly, like, I mean, I have spent a week looking at Israel-Palestine fairly intensely, and having done so, I'm really glad that you guys didn't vote for me to study this more intensely, because I find it incredibly depressing. I didn't realize I was going to find it this depressing. Like, I was kind of bugged by just how consistently I found that, you know, the Israeli public is no longer interested in anything like peace. So I'm not going to do the research to like, maybe I will at some point, but I'm not going to like go back through the, you know, well, why didn't Arafat take that deal in 2004? Why didn't, you know, Arafat, you know, do this? Or, you know, Ehud Barak, you know, gave him everything. And like, I'm sure if I looked into the fine print, I could find an argument pretty comprehensively demolishing that argument. But it's just not worth my time. It's, having looked at it for a week, it's pretty clear where this is trending. It is, you know, there will not be a free Palestinian state. The Palestinians are a subject population of the Israeli state, and that is kind of a unique. I've agreed for the longest time that, yeah, why are we focusing so much on poor Israel? There's just plenty more horrible things going on in the world. And you know what? In the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, there were. This is a state of 15 million people where 5 million people are maintained without rights or control of things. And I don't think it's going to change. I think it's only going to continue. And yeah, if I were a Palestinian, I'd like to think I'd be somebody who was brave enough to have died for the Palestinian cause. But if I were a Palestinian, I would have gotten out. Sad. to be clear, I have no truck with suicide bombers. I have no truck with people throwing rockets at civilians. But yeah, like in 2018, those guys who walked towards the border as Israeli snipers took them out. I think killed 200 people and literally with sniper bullets maimed like 9,000 of them. Like that. I mean, that gives me goosebumps. I mean, those people are truly heroic. I would not be one of those guys. I'm a fucking coward. Like I would have been, I would have taken advantage of any opportunity to get to the United States and send angry tweets about Palestine and get on with my life. Wow, there's a lot of super chats to catch up with. Sorry. Where are we? Where did those go? Okay, Scott Locks. What is Israel's long-term reason for a single state? The Palestinians leave? Is it working? I think Israel's long-term plan is the status quo. I think Israel's population is growing massively. I think their settlement network is getting thicker and thicker. What was so weird about this time is everybody's paying attention to the Sheikh Jarrah issue. This is something, and it's interesting. A lot of people on Twitter were laughing their asses off at a Wall Street Journal opinion article this morning that was like, "This is just a real estate dispute, and it's only matters. I know people are only paying attention because the landlord's Jewish." And it was just like, oh my God, like it was laughable because everybody knows that's not the case. The argument in Sheikh Jarrah is that the territory should go back to Israeli settlers because Israelis had lived there before 1948. Imagine being a Palestinian and arguing that any territory in Israel should go back to Palestinians because it was Palestinian before 1948. Laughable, absolute absurdity. So the Wall Street Journal opinion page, Wall Street Journal is a good newspaper. Wall Street Journal opinion page is famously a bunch of right-wing cranks. And they ran like something that would have been fine 5-10 years ago, everyone would have nodded along with and said, "Oh no, it's just racist. That it's just a real estate dispute," and they were sort of laughed off. But like the fact that we're paying attention to Sheikh Jarrah, like that's happening every day in the West Bank. That is happening slowly. Gaza is just this place that's going to continue to be brutalized. I don't know if Gaza went 7 years without throwing a rocket at Israel, and Israel just maintained the open-air prison. So I'm not entirely, I do not support Hamas. I do not support their violence, but, Hamas restrained itself for 7 years, and there was no lift of the blockade, so I don't think there's going to be any lift after this time either. Gaza is its own thing. The West Bank is slowly getting Swiss cheesed further and further. It's getting further and further cut up. It's getting further and further, and that's just going to continue. And they're going to make the life of the Palestinians more and more miserable. I think that there'll be periodic opportunities for Palestinians who are carefully vetted to move to the United States and move other places to depopulate it. And then, I think if we get a serious level of instability, who knows, like 20 years, every Arab country now seems to be pretty debilitated, but maybe decades from now, like the whole Netanyahu policy of cheerleading for the United States as it turns the region into a smoking ruin is pretty stupid. The Hezbollah was produced by Israeli policy in Israel, in Lebanon in the 80s. So now that policy that produced Hezbollah has now been expanded to Iraq and Syria entirely. Like that's not gonna go well for Israel in future decades. So I think whether it's in the context of the U.S. system falling apart in like a World War III situation, or just like 3 or 4 decades from now, there being a real legitimate threat to Israel again, I think that everyone who's left in Gaza and the West Bank will get a bus ticket to Cairo or Amman or a mass grave. It's pretty grim, but I think that's what I see now. What we're going to see is status quo and continued brutalization and chipping away at Palestinian rights that the Israeli government will will make Palestinians leave. And then when there's an opportunity, either World War III or a serious Arab or serious Turkish or serious Iranian threat to Israel, we'll see like a more final solution. So yeah, grim, huh? Brando Commander says, I think the real winners are Israel and Iran. Iran and Saudi Arabia are making a deal to curb U.S. sanctions, and Netanyahu solidified his position as PM. It is unquestionable that Netanyahu and Hamas saved each other. Netanyahu, there was a deal to unseat Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu that actually included apparently Muslim Arab Israelis that are connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. So we were going to have a Muslim Brotherhood government in Israel. Sorry, Muslim Brotherhood affiliated government in Israel that was going to unseat Bibi Netanyahu, which is just insane. But thanks to the Hamas missiles, that possibility has disappeared. Netanyahu is back in power, and Hamas has shored up because they're gonna put together posters of look at all these dead Palestinian children that we made or that we helped make. But oh, isn't it terrible? So Hamas is back in power. So yeah, Israel, Netanyahu and Hamas have definitely put themselves back together. I'm not familiar with this idea that I know that Iran and Saudi Arabia are talking, but I don't understand. I haven't read a report saying that Iran and Saudi Arabia are making a deal to curb U.S. sanctions, because that's quite that's news to me. I know that Iran and Saudi Arabia were talking, but you have to understand, like the curbing of I think Saudi Arabia has realized after the bombing of the Abqaiq refinery, was that back in 2019? That nobody really cares enough about Saudi Arabia to defend them, basically, and how much less important the Houthis, supposedly, but with the support of the Iranian government, it's generally acknowledged, bombed Saudi Arabia's oil refineries in 2019, knocking out like 5% of world oil production for a week. And it didn't really affect markets, and the United States didn't give a shit, didn't do anything. Donald Trump, the big Iran opponent, didn't do a goddamn thing. So I think at that point, Saudi Arabia realized that, well, shit, like if there's a real war between the United States and Iran, which Saudi Arabia had been sort of like gleefully advocating for, like a fucking bunch of morons, for quite some time, I think at that point they realized, oh my God, Iran can't bomb Israel seriously, because if they bomb Israel seriously, then the United States will actually get more committed to the war. They're just going to destroy our oil industry entirely. So I think that Saudi Arabia is interested in, not having a war with Iran, but at the same time, they really don't want sanctions to end, because then another 3 million barrels of oil gets dumped onto the market. We were at this sort of amazing moment for oil markets this past week, where we saw the price of a barrel of oil crest $70 for really only the third time since 2015. And in order to do that, Saudi Arabia has dramatically limited its production. Russia has dramatically limited its production. Venezuela has been completely taken off the market by U.S. sanctions. Yeah, so there's been this tremendous limiting of supply. So I'd be very surprised if Iran was negotiating with Saudi Arabia to get around sanctions to try to get more Iranian oil on the world market, because Saudi Arabia's been killing itself to try to get the price up to a decent level. And if you just throw another 3 million barrels of oil a day from Iran, Iran is already putting some of its oil on the world market, but for it to be able to get there through more legal and open means would not be good for the oil price. Okay. Oh man, there's so many super chats. I'm very grateful. Let's see. Did I miss any up here? Oh, Christopher Murtaugh. Shit. Yeah, sorry. Oh man, there's a lot I've missed. I apologize. Okay, where are we here? Okay, did Gary Davidson. Anon, how do you think the Yemen situation will change under President Biden? President Biden made a lot of commitments. Right out the gate, he undid some of the more disgusting vandalism that the Trump administration had done. He said that we're going to stop He said, we're going to stop supporting Saudi Arabian offensive operations in Yemen. That was a lie. That's not true. That is not something that has happened. The United States absolutely continues to support Saudi offensive actions in Yemen, absolutely continues to support Saudi blockade of the country that has killed probably hundreds of thousands of people. It's impossible to get real numbers. Saudi Arabia does not, this is acknowledged by very serious people, Saudi Arabia does not have an independent war-making capability in Yemen if the United States is not servicing the planes, giving them intelligence, backing them up. Biden said he was no longer doing that. He's still doing it. There are somewhat extenuating circumstances. The Houthis, who have been winning the war the entire time, are carrying out an offensive against Marib, which they've been carrying out for a couple of years now. That, you know, if they take Marib, it's pretty much over, and Saudi Arabia has just been defeated. The Houthis aren't particularly interested in a ceasefire unless Saudi Arabia lifts the blockade. Saudi Arabia, Biden has committed really to stopping supporting offensive operations. The Saudi blockade of Yemen is an offensive operation. I don't know. I think anger is the appropriate response to the Biden administration's lies on this. However, like, it is in a larger galaxy of things. The horrifying thing about the Gaza war is that I could see a pathway through which it would make the U.S. return to the Iran nuclear deal more likely. The reason the war in Yemen happened in the first place was because Obama needed to give a gift to the Saudis so they would be less obstructive of the initial signing of the Iran nuclear deal. The Biden administration cannot do everything at once. I am tremendously interested. I mean, they, you know, supposedly withdrawing from Afghanistan, that's a different question. I'm tremendously eager for them to get back into the JCPOA, because if the Iran nuclear deal is signed, I've got a number of videos on this, then all other issues in the region become easier to solve because the United States can actually start working with Iran. This is another reason why it's tremendously important for the United States to distance itself from Israel a little bit, and the brutality in Gaza helps with that a little bit, because then all of these other issues become easier to solve. So if the Biden administration, you know, I'm, I guess, an activist or an independent who cares a lot about Yemen. So yeah, I will say the Biden administration is lying about Yemen. They have not honored their commitments. It is horrific what's happening in Yemen. But if I were a politician, if I was in the US government, I could see, just for sequencing, you know, if they are more focused on getting back into the JCPOA, because if the JCPOA, which is a tremendously difficult bit of, if that happens, then resolving the Yemen conflict in collaboration between Iran and Saudi Arabia becomes dramatically easier. So I can see that justification, but at this point thus far, Biden has been a disappointment on Yemen. But it's worth it if the Iran nuclear deal actually happens this year. We'll see. Thank you, Anon. Where are these other ones? Christopher Murtaugh, sad to see from the chat there's a lot of hate going around, especially on this issue. Thanks for giving everyone a good context. Hopefully this leads better understanding and compassion. I mean, I hope so, man. But I'm not surprised that there's a lot of hate in this chat. I haven't really checked in as much. Loga, how's it going? It's a tremendously contentious situation, and the fact, if we're having a discussion at all in this live chat, I think it's a testament to, well, certainly a testament to Loga's moderating skills, but I think the testament to the character of folks who show up here who are more interested in discussing the world as it is and potential solutions than making their sort of national points. Which is unfair, because I'm often, as I try to be honest about, I'm often making my national points as a U.S. citizen. Yeah, well, thank you, Chris, for the Christopher for the super chat, and yeah, I mean, it's a contentious issue, but I'm committed to bringing people who believe things on both sides of of the of every conflict together to try to build bridges. And thank you, Christopher, for being a supporter of that endeavor. Okay, Scott Locks, what is Israel's long-term reason for a single state? The Palestinian. Okay, I think I covered that. Brando Commando, I think the real winners are Israel and Iran. Yes, I think so. We covered that. Tony Gohagan, hey Robbo, question: is Palestine legally occupied? Can you give us an overview now? So there's no international law. International law is not a real thing. My understanding is that there are a number of United Nations resolutions that say that the Israeli occupation is illegal, or that certain things are supposed to happen. And yeah, there's a lot of UN security resolutions that say powerful actors are willing to act to make those Security Council resolutions a reality. Traditionally, that's been the United States. I think in the future, I'd like it to be a broader coalition of real actors. The United Nations, creates its own peacekeeping forces that do things. I think there's actually between Syria, in the Golan Heights, between Israeli occupied Golan, I guess now confirmed annexed to Israel Golan Heights, and Syria, I think there is a UN peacekeeping force. But the United Nations would not be allowed to put a force into. I see a lot of comments like, oh, the UN should just jump in there and divide the two peoples, and it's like there's a real lack of understanding of just how terribly small the amount of territory Israel is dealing with is. This acts in Israel's favor. I mean, like the West Bank, the much bigger territory, is one of the most comprehensively policed and controlled and surveilled patches of land on the planet. Just look at Google Maps and compare the size of Israel to the size of anything else around it. I've never been to Israel, but I've been to Lebanon, and it was fascinating just looking at. I'd take a bus ride, and I would go half the length of Yemen, half the length of Lebanon. I went up from Beirut to Byblos, and I was like, just looking at the map, I was like, this was like an hour and a half bus ride, not a particularly fast one, and that's like half the fucking length of Lebanon. I mean, Israel is similarly situated. I'm sorry, I think I'm getting away from the larger question. But is Palestine illegally occupied? I mean, I guess. But one of the other really disturbing elements, something that we were hoping we were going to get away from in the 1990s, was the idea of might makes right. I think Putin, in response, in a somewhat understandable, if not justifiable response to NATO expansion over a long period of time, Putin invaded Crimea. That was taken illegally under international law. Nobody's going to invade and take that back from him. The Western Sahara is a issue that is a very small issue that I famously don't like talking about. It pisses me off because I think it's functioned, among other things, to create acrimony between Morocco and Algeria, two countries that should be working together against European imperialism, and instead have spent decades fighting with each other over the Western Sahara. But the Trump administration, in return for a deal between Morocco and Israel, acknowledged Morocco's annexation of the Western Sahara, which is James Baker, who was George H.W. Bush's Secretary of State. Famously, Baker is seen as one of the last people who accomplished anything worthwhile in U.S. foreign policy. He wrote and he's a Trump voter, wrote a stinging rebuke of the Trump administration's acceptance of the Moroccan invasion of Western Sahara. This sort of dream of the 90s, or even dream of the post-World War II era, where aggression was no longer acceptable in any sense, is ending. It's over. Saudi Arabia has, because Obama gave it to them, and other folks in the Security Council, I think, acquiesced because they too had an interest in the Iran nuclear deal going forward. Saudi Arabia has a UN Security Council resolution saying that the Houthis are evil, and it's not exactly what it says, but the Houthis are the aggressors and they're bad. This is the to be clear, pretty bad, but not a foreign invader, group that has governed most of Yemen for most of the population of Yemen for almost 7 years now. Saudi Arabia's got a resolution that completely covers all of its actions in Yemen, as horrific as they are. They're losing the war anyway, and it's likely that the UN will sort of revise itself. There are all kinds of UN resolutions that say all kinds of things, and it's a better world where UN resolutions are honored and countries don't take places, against the will of the world in general, where conquest simply doesn't happen. The Moroccans took Western Sahara in like 1975. Trump administration said it's fine. We acknowledge this annexation. The Biden administration decided not to go against that. The Israeli taking of this territory goes back to 1967. We're talking 50 years now, and a bunch of UN resolutions that nobody's ever going to enforce. Illegally occupied, international law. It is better for civilization. It is better for human beings if laws are agreed upon and observed. The rule of law is better everywhere. International law is always and forever aspirational. This is an aspiration that will not be met, I don't believe. So I hope that helped. Is there another super chat? Oh, there's another super chat. I'm in Mogadam. Media turning on Israel, U.S. leaving the Middle East, Iran getting more powerful every year. Will Iran's prediction about Israel downfall come true? Love you, Rob. Hey, thanks, Ami. I don't think Iran's prediction of 50 years from now, if something changes completely, 100 years from now, could Israel fall and plummet? I do believe that Israel needs to find a way to legitimately appeal to its neighbors, legitimately appeal to the Arab world. The weird thing is the Abraham Accords, that I believe to be fundamentally illegitimate because they were signed with Arab dictatorships, do have the germ of an idea there. Iran, I believe the United States should collaborate with Iran and Turkey and balance Iran and Turkey off of each other. And I think, unfortunately, to some extent because of Israel, but not exclusively, there are no real Arab powers left anymore. Algeria looks like a real Arab power, but that's a country that's reliant on a higher oil price than they're ever going to have again. Morocco, maybe, but it's looking pretty shaky too. And these are places, Tunisia is the most exciting place. And, who knows, 20, 30 years from now in North Africa, you could see like maybe a real Arab power. In the context, if Israel continues to be like a pariah state, then there's maybe a somewhere 50 years off or 100 years off where Israel is seriously under threat. Under the current set of circumstances, I don't see it. No, I think Israel's going to be there. Quite Israel looks more to Israel. To me, Israel looks more secure than it ever has been. And I think with a change of character of Arab regimes that I fondly hope for, and I think we will see, perhaps Israel will appear more threatened, but it's also possible that Arabs will decide that they're more worried about the threat from Turks and Iranians than they're worried about the threats from Israel. Because a lot of what's threatening about Israel is it's the representative of European imperialism. Israel's really invested in this idea. No, we're Jews from everywhere. It's like, okay, cool. Everybody who's ever been in charge of that country is from Belarus or fucking Wisconsin. Israel is, white imperialism. And that's something that is changing within Israel as it develops its own culture, as hopefully more Mizrahi and Sephardim are incorporated into leadership, as Israel becomes more of a in its own way, multinational or, its own national state. That'll shift. And Europe is couldn't be less threatening at this point. I mean, France is still holding on to an empire in West Africa, but hopefully more and more tenuously. And if the United States does pull back from the Middle East, then perhaps the democratic Arab polity I'm envisioning for 30-40 years from now will be more worried about Turkish or Iranian influence than it is worried about what this one sort of fairly small state at the edge of the Mediterranean is doing, and might be more interested in working with Israel to fend off Iranian and Turkish imperialism. That's a fond hope. We'll see. Who knows? But yeah, the idea that I think this whole talk, was talking about how I don't believe that Israel is in any serious danger at this point. No more super chats. Okay, non-super chats. Victory TRD. Add more freedom fighters. What are the best and worst case scenarios for Israel from the current events? Honestly, they're the worst case scenario. We're all still in media war territory. I do not believe Hezbollah is going to pile in here. I do not believe that any kind of Arab country is going to make any serious move here. I think the worst case scenario for Israel is some kind of really, like, some missile falls on a school, and instead of just killing a few dozen kids, they kill 100 kids or something like that. Yeah, I don't see there being real. That's sort of part of the message. Is like I don't see there being real risk to Israel here. It's of course horrible what's happening to what's happened to those 10, 20 Israelis and foreigners who've been killed, and it's also tragic what has happened to the 200, or are we up to 300 Palestinians who've been killed? I don't, in the context of this new Gaza war, I don't see a real downside for Israel other than politics with the United States getting more difficult, which I would like them to do. But as I think the message of this whole presentation was, like, I don't see a real threat to Israel here. Questions. MI says, not a solution, but why aren't nations offering land for Palestinians for a state? Russia once offered lots of land for a Jewish state, not for it, just curious. Because the Palestinians consider the land of Palestine to be theirs and as important to them as anything. I think we will see in the United States, quite possibly, because the Palestinians, a lot of them are actually fairly well educated, and yeah, I think we will see more of a push to bring more Palestinians to the United States, which I'm all for, of course. But of course, that also aids Israeli ethnic cleansing. Yeah, I'm 100% eager. But like, why would Russia have been eager to accept all kinds of Palestinians? They're not really super eager to help out, Israeli or U.S. policy, and I think they're getting closer to Israel. But why would they do that? So we're gonna. So we've created this incredible problem by giving Palestinians land to Israelis. So we're just gonna give somebody else's land to the Palestinians. Sorry, don't mean to be mocking, but I don't see that as much of a solution. What I do think is that, yeah, we're going to see probably pushes for Palestinian relocation to the United States, which again, it helps Israeli ethnic cleansing, but it certainly helps Israeli ethnic cleansing in the most positive way possible. So, and is good for the flourishing of those individuals. But it's, of course, against the Palestinian cause. So, yeah. Can you please read loud and slow? I'm sending another 5, even though I'm poor and penniless, because I was taught to be cautious. Let's be Facebook pals brothers. I have a Facebook page. Hop on. Thank you, Amin, for the generosity. I don't recommend that anybody who is penniless or out of resources gives money to me. Please don't, in fact. I'd be happy to PayPal you back, Amin, if you're penniless. Reach out to me on Twitter at RoboLaw. I now have a More Freedom Foundation Instagram page rather than using my own personal one. So yeah, you can reach out to me there as well. And you can find my email on the YouTube page if you're interested in reaching out to me there. Thank you for Super Chat generosity. Please do not send me money if you don't have it, obviously. Question. People are people 32 says, man, why spend your own money when you can spend someone else's? Yes, but I don't want to spend poor people's money, as he had expressed in the Super Chat. Why KKK says, Israel doesn't need money from us, but don't you think they need political and technical support? They are 10 million in a small country, even if they are smart. Swedish are smart also. But where's the threat? I think I talked earlier at the beginning of how, like, for the United States to distance itself from Israel, like, we can stop sending them money, we can stop blocking every UN discussion of it, but we will, we can stop blocking every UN discussion, but, you know, we can put forward Security Council resolutions that are toothless and meaningless. It's not like the United States will ever get to a point where it has abandoned Israel to the extent where it's like, oh, like 40 years from now, like the Turkish Empire decides to crush Israel. Like, the United States will never be at a point where it's not going to intervene in that. I mean, that's just the nature of our relationship with Israel. I mean, never this century. I mean, who knows? Like, a lot can change in 8 decades. You know, the world could look entirely different. The United States might not exist anymore. So yeah, but like in terms of, like, you know, Israel does not need us for what it's currently doing at all. Yeah, my Insta is at More Freedom Foundation. I haven't put much there yet, but I'll put more there. I intend to put more there. I guess we are coming to the end. I can start. Well, no, I should answer some questions that aren't super chats. So you think the U.S. can accept each of the 5 million Palestinians? Of course, the United States takes in 1 million people a year. Of course, we can take the 5 million Palestinians. Would we be willing to? I think is an important question. That's the only question. Unfortunately, I think the United States. You know, there have been 3 big waves of immigration to the United States. The one from 1965 to 2017 was the smallest of the 3 big waves. I think there will be a 4th big wave, but smallest relative to the size of U.S. population. But I think we might be in for a 20 or even 40-year break before we get back to being as welcoming as we used to be. I hope we will get back to being as welcoming as we used to be. However, I think we will start taking in more refugees. The United States has virtually unlimited capacity to take people in. Problem is just convincing the people in power of that fact. People in the United States love to talk about how we don't have a secure border, which is absolute horseshit. In the Reagan era, we had borders that people could literally just walk over everywhere. And we were a happier, freer country because of it. We now have a tremendously militarized border, thousands of paramilitary welfare queens who depend on you know, billions of dollars of budgets all the time. So now, of course, they're invested in pretending there's some kind of border problem. Anyway, if I can rant about immigration all day. But yeah, of course, the U.S. could take 5 million, all 5 million Palestinians, and we'd benefit from it. Israel's an occupying force, yes. Question, More Freedom Foundation, what has happened to Christianity and Islam? Well, that's a very long, that's a very involved question. I don't think I can really resolve that now. I've only got another 10 minutes here. Nobody, that they just didn't take illusions. Radu and Baba, what do you think about the role of Turkey to oppose Israel? It's interesting because traditionally Turkey and Israel really bonded on repression. The Turks repressed the Kurds and the Israelis repressed the Palestinians, and they sort of bonded on that. There's been a real break in that. It's very weird that since 2015, as Turkey has gone back to repressing Kurds on an industrial scale, it has also fallen out with Israel, which is surprising. But I think that the Kurdish problem in Turkey has weirdly, and Erdogan showed the way forward on this before he lost an election and decided to get back in bed with the nationalists. I think that the Kurdish problem weirdly has been solved. This is a dramatic overstatement, but compared to the Palestinian issue for Israel, has been solved by economic success. And post Erdogan, I think there really is a real path forward to joint peace and prosperity for Turks and Kurds and whatnot, in a way that there wasn't before Israel started getting rich in the 90s, well, the 80s to an extent, 90s, and really in the 2000s up through the early 2010s. And I don't think, and that actually might hurt the potential for Israel and Turkey to get on in the future. So that's what I have to say about that. YYKKK says, thanks. And I say, well, thank you for a super chat. That's very grateful. Okay, I think I'm going to start spieling. We've got 10 minutes left here. I'm only going to answer questions that are super chats. Thank you all for being here. My name is Robert Morris. Every Tuesday, I upload a video. Sometimes it is a live, once a month, it is a live chat like this. Often it's a produced video. Sometimes it's just a rant. There's something up every Tuesday. Since I got into my new apartment a couple months back, I've been trying to do 2 videos a week. So hopefully there'll finally be a long promised video on Libya by Friday. We'll see. So I do one big public live chat like this a month. Is that another super chat? No. I do one big public live chat like this a month. I also do a patrons only live chat once a month as well. Patreon is where I make most of my money. It's where I get the money to pay my rent and buy me food. If you sign up for that, you get access to the patrons only live cast. What's great about the patrons only live cast is I get to answer every question. There's a lot of folks on this stuff on this channel that people really want me to discuss that I just don't get to because, you know, it's a big world and it's hard to cover things in as much detail as I like to cover them. But with the patrons only live cast, newscast, that is the patrons' opportunity to force me to cover what they want me to cover. I get a list of stuff the morning before the patrons only live chat. I research every issue that the patrons want me to research. And then I discuss it with folks in a much smaller context. There's really only usually 5 to 10 people who participate in the live chat, so I deal with every comment, every question. I think after this video, it's probably going to be the only point at which I talk about Israel and Gaza for like the rest of this year and maybe ever again, because God, this is depressing. Sign up for Patreon. You support me, and you also get access to the patrons on the newscast where you can force me to talk about what you want me to talk about. I have a Twitter account at RoboLaw. Please do follow me at RoboLaw. I spend way too much time on Twitter. I want to cut down on that a little bit, but that's the best way to reach me. And that's where the conversation continues all the time. A lot of my research happens on Twitter. The best part of my research happens when I'm reading books. But yeah, it's, if you enjoy the conversation in the comments, it's at my Twitter feed at RoboLaw, is ROBBOLAW, is where the conversation happens all the time. That's, let's see, that's at RoboLaw. Where did I put my books? I have written books that you should look into. By the way, if anybody does a super chat, I'll answer your super chat question. I've written a book called Fatka and the New Birth of American Empire. Talks about how the real strength of the United States is an array of sort of acronym-based legal concepts and agencies and laws that are really boring to learn about, but actually are where the true seat of U.S. power is today. That's a very complicated and technical one. Everybody's lying about Islam, which is basically about the U.S.-Saudi relationship and how it's at the root of all that terrorism stuff that we used to care so much about. And that's sort of a good, fun read. I was told by a guy in an agency who was responsible for carrying out U.S. policy in one of our wars on a junior level. And he was like, wow, reading this, I had no idea about any of this, which is frankly kind of horrifying that we have folks doing supposedly intelligence work who don't know this basic publicly available information, the truth about the US-Saudi relationship, and really the genesis of all the terrorism that we've been so worried about over the first 2 decades of the century. And then the big one is avoiding the British Empire, which basically explains everything, I think. It's sort of a stealth history of the unified world system that sort of got started in the 1750s, and talks about the British Empire and how the United States is very similar to the United States, to the British Empire, and is making a lot of very similar mistakes to the ones that the British Empire that led not just to the end of the British Empire, but also to cataclysmic world wars, and how we'd like to avoid that. Anyway, so those are my books. That's my Twitter. That's my Instagram. I think we're going to call that. I think we're going to call that a day. I'm very grateful to everybody who showed up. I hope I didn't say anything that gets me canceled. I guess it would be best to end with a hope or a prayer, if you're more theocratically oriented, that the conflict in Gaza and Palestine ends as soon as possible, that the conflict in Yemen ends as soon as possible, that conflict in Syria ends as soon as possible, the conflict in Ethiopia ends as soon as possible, and that we just stop killing each other, folks. There's really no reason for it. We've got everything we need for a utopia, and we just keep choosing not to do it. Anyway, thank you so much. I'm delighted that so many folks showed up here. This channel is absolutely nothing without you guys. Yeah, I can jaw all I want, but without folks to show up, participate, like, subscribe, comment, this channel's nothing. So please do keep showing up. Things have changed with the YouTube algorithm, so that I don't pick up a lot of new subscribers, but the ones that I do have basically made this a going concern, and I'm tremendously grateful because this is the best job on the planet. Thank you so much, and have a lovely day, week.